I'm really torn up about a situation I found myself in recently and could use some outside perspective. This involves me, a 32-year-old female, and my ex-husband Dan, a 35-year-old male, his new girlfriend Kate, their child, and a decision I made that has caused a lot of controversy among my friends and family. A bit of background. I grew up in a home that was far from the nurturing environment a child needs. Both of my parents were deeply unhappy and expressed their frustration through constant verbal and physical altercations. As an only child, I had no escape from the daily arguments and fights. Their relationship was a cycle of abuse and reconciliation, a pattern that became my twisted template for what love looked like. This chaotic home life led me to seek affection and validation elsewhere from a very young age. I lost my virginity early, mistaking physical intimacy for the love and stability I craved. This set the stage for my future relationships. I gravitated towards partners who displayed traits similar to my parents: controlling, manipulative, and sometimes physically abusive. It was a cycle I didn't know how to break, partly because it was all I had ever known. Before I met Dan, my dating history was like a textbook case of repeating abusive patterns. I had been in several relationships that started off great but soon turned toxic. I endured emotional manipulation, gaslighting, and in one case, physical abuse. By the time I met Dan, my self-esteem was at an all-time low, and I had started to believe that this cycle of abuse was all I deserved. Dan was different, or so I thought. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in my well-being. He was like a ray of hope, convincing me that not all relationships were doomed to turn abusive. For the first time in years, I felt valued and loved. However, looking back, there were red flags that I chose to ignore. Dan had a way of subtly controlling situations. He would make decisions for both of us under the guise of being protective. At first, I saw this as him being caring, but he would get upset if I tried to assert my independence. His charm began to feel more like manipulation, but I brushed these feelings aside, thinking I was just being overly cautious because of my past. When I discovered Dan's affair with Kate, it was like the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. The realization that he had been living this double life while pretending to be the perfect husband shattered me. It was the ultimate betrayal, echoing the manipulation and deceit I had experienced in my past relationships. The divorce was messy and painful. Dan moved out, and we cut off communication, which was the best thing for my mental health. I started therapy to work through my issues and to understand why I kept falling into these destructive patterns. It was a long, tough journey, but I was finally starting to feel like I was breaking free from the cycle of abuse. That's why, when Dan showed up out of the blue and left his child with me, it felt like a huge step backward. It brought back all the feelings of being controlled and disrespected. Calling the police wasn't just about not wanting to look after the child. It was me trying to maintain the boundaries I had worked so hard to establish. I'm sharing all this because I think it's important to understand why I reacted the way I did. Maybe it was an overreaction, but in that moment, it felt like my only option to protect my newfound sense of self. Dan and I were married for 6 years before we got divorced at the end of 2020. Our marriage ended because of his affair with Kate, during which she got pregnant and had a son who is now 3 years old. The whole affair was devastating for me, both mentally and physically, as I was at high risk during the pandemic when all of this unfolded. After our divorce, Dan moved out, and we cut off all communication. Fast forward to last week, and out of nowhere, Dan shows up at my house with his son in tow. He barely gave me any explanation, just mumbled something about Kate being in labor with complications and needing him at the hospital. He left the child at my doorstep before I could even respond. I was shocked and didn't know what to do. I tried calling and texting Dan multiple times, but he didn't reply. I was completely unprepared to take care of a child, especially under these circumstances. I had my plans, and babysitting my ex's son, a constant reminder of the affair that ended our marriage, was not part of them. After a lot of thought and finding myself at a loss, I made a decision. I called the police, explained the situation, and told them that I hadn't agreed to look after the child and couldn't reach the father. The police came and took the child, and I thought that was the end of it. But then, early the next day, Dan called me, furious. The police had apparently gone to the hospital, pulled him out of the delivery room to take care of his son, and he missed the birth of his second child. Kate also had complications during the delivery and was in intensive care. Dan lashed out at me, calling me an asshole for what I did. He said his and Kate's parents couldn't help since they live far away and have medical conditions. I was so overwhelmed and angry. I told him he should have thought about all this before dumping his child on me. We ended the call on bad terms, with him calling me even more names. I've since talked to some family and friends about it, and the opinions are split. Some agree with me, saying it wasn't my responsibility, while others think I should have cared for the child in this emergency and not involved the police. By the time I met Dan, I was already a veteran of toxic relationships. He seemed different at first, caring, attentive, and seemingly supportive. But as I mentioned before, there were red flags that I chose to ignore, likely because his behavior was familiar in a twisted way. It mirrored the dynamics I grew up with. Understanding this pattern has been a crucial part of my therapy and healing process. The end of my marriage to Dan was both a low point and a turning point for me. It forced me to confront the unhealthy patterns I'd been repeating and to start the hard work of breaking them. So when Dan dropped off his son without warning, it wasn't just a simple case of me not wanting to babysit. It was an echo of my past, feeling trapped, controlled, and used by someone I once trusted. Calling the police was a desperate measure, but it was also a stand against falling back into old patterns of being manipulated. I called Dan to talk about what happened. It wasn't easy. When we finally spoke, I explained how his actions, leaving his son at my doorstep without any prior discussion, had affected me. I told him about my past, the pattern of abusive relationships I've been in, and how his thoughtlessness had triggered a sense of panic and helplessness in me. To my surprise, Dan was somewhat receptive. He admitted that he hadn't thought things through and apologized for putting me in that position. However, he still maintained that I overreacted by calling the police. We didn't end the call on a positive note, but at least I had said my piece. As for my friends and family, the reactions have been mixed. Some of my friends were fully supportive, saying that I had every right to protect my boundaries and that calling the police was a justified response. They know my history and how hard I've worked to overcome my past. They saw my action as a stand for my independence and a break from my pattern of being pushed around. However, my family's reaction was less supportive. My parents, in particular, were upset. They believe I should have been more understanding of the situation and that families should stick together in times of crisis. Their reaction hurt, but it also made me realize how much my upbringing and their relationship influenced my view of what is normal and acceptable in times of conflict. This whole situation has been a roller coaster of emotions and a real eye-opener. It forced me to confront not only Dan, but also the lingering impact of my childhood and past relationships. I'm starting to see that setting boundaries, even with family, is not only healthy but necessary for my well-being. I've been doing a lot of self-reflection. I wanted to share where I am now and how I plan to move forward from this whole ordeal. In the aftermath of everything that happened, I've come to realize that my reaction was influenced by a lifetime of experiences that I'm still working through. While some might see my decision to call the police as extreme, for me, it was a moment where I finally put my foot down and set a boundary, something I've struggled with my entire life. I've learned that growth often comes from uncomfortable situations. This entire incident forced me to face not just my issues with Dan, but also deeper-rooted issues from my past. It was a painful reminder of the cycle of abuse I grew up in and later repeated in my relationships, but it also showed me how far I've come. Moving forward, I plan to continue my therapy sessions. They've been instrumental in helping me understand my past and how it affects my present. I'm learning to establish healthy boundaries and to recognize and respond to red flags in relationships, whether romantic, familial, or platonic. As for rebuilding, I'm focusing on creating a peaceful and positive life for myself. I'm channeling my energy into my work, hobbies, and building a support network of friends who understand and respect my journey. I'm also working on repairing relationships within my family, explaining to them why I reacted the way I did, and hoping they can understand and respect my perspective. In regards to Dan, while we may never have a friendly relationship, I hope we can reach a point of mutual respect for the sake of his son. The child is innocent in all of this, and I regret that he got caught up in our issues,